here we are into our third session in this series, Investigating Christianity, where we're trying to define what exactly Christianity asserts to be true, and then ask the questions, is there any good reason to think that those claims might in fact be true, and what about some of the key objections to those claims? How does it hold up? What evidence can it suggest for itself? We started by sort of deriving the basic options humans have come up with down through the centuries for what kind of reality we're living in by asking two questions. Is ultimate reality personal? Is there someone out there, or is it an impersonal something? And then, is that personal or impersonal reality finite, limited, or unlimited? And of course, Christianity falls into that second column there, theism, the belief in a personal, infinite God, as sort of the ground floor truth about reality. The one wrinkle in the last at least few generations in Western societies we had to add is there such a thing as truth, at least in these big picture items, philosophical truth, spiritual truth. And for most of human society, down through history, the answer has been yes. And this has been about sorting through the evidence, the counter-arguments back and forth. But I think the consensus in our culture is this new option, the rightmost column, spiritual relativism, which says that these things really are preference. When we try to talk truth or falsehood, we're making a category mistake, as the philosophers would say. Very understandable. It's reacting to real problems with how some kind of religious bigots have behaved down through history, including some Christian ones. So it's understandable it's desiring to make this move, but what I gave a pitch for is that the cure of spiritual relativism is worse than those problems, and that there are other ways to solve the problems besides giving up on the possibility of real truth. And that, in fact, my argument was, if in any category we need truth, if we can get it, I think it would be in precisely these big picture questions. You know, what happens to the people I care about when they die? Where do I stand in the universe? If there is a God, what is that relationship supposed to be like? That's where precisely we stand in need of regular old truth. Maybe not mathematically proven truth, but a reasonable basis. So I just asked last week that we kind of set aside that set of assumptions and instead suggested the way that we might detect spiritual truth from spiritual falsehood. That's where we left off. And what I want to move on to tonight and next week is this topic of Christianity and other religions. Next to the problem I had with science, how can you take the Bible seriously in light of science? This was my number 2 issue. As I began to understand what Christianity claimed, I realized, okay, it's making some big claims, that it's special, that there's unique information. And I realized, there's a lot of other religious systems down through places and times that also think they're special. So how's that supposed to work out? What about the people who've never even heard of Christianity, for example? There's a whole lot of those that have lived and died. So there's a cluster of questions that I went through. I'm going to share things that I found helpful tonight, at least part of it. We'll finish up next week on this. And what I want to do, and the same approach to this as I'll take when we get to science, is I want to first lay out what is the biblical view. If we just go to the text, what's it say about the relationship of biblical Christianity and other religions? And then consider some important objections to that view. So to sort of extract what the biblical view of other religions is, I want to go first to a passage in Acts chapter 17. And I think this is a good passage to begin with because this is really the first time as the Christian movement was beginning to spread through the Roman Empire. This is the first time that it was presented to a group of people who did not share the basic biblical worldview. Christianity started as Judaism. Jesus, of course, was the Jewish Messiah according to Christianity. The first church was in Jerusalem. All the first Christians were Jews. And so up until this point, as the Christian movement has spread, it has been presented to Jews and a group of non-Jews who had become intrigued with Judaism. They were called the God-fearers, and they would attend the meetings and learn the Bible, the Old Testament. And so what we've seen up to this point in the book of Acts is presentations to those people, and there's all kind of assumptions that can be made there. You're coming out of the same worldview, the same basic ideas, a lot of shared ideas. Here now, Paul is in Athens, and actually, even though, of course, this is the Roman era, Athens remains sort of the heart, intellectually, philosophically, of the Roman Empire. And the heart of Athens really was this meeting that we're going to read about in the Areopagus. It says, now that all the Athenians and the strangers visiting there used to spend their time in nothing other than telling or hearing something new. And Paul stood in the midst of the Areopagus and said, men of Athens, I observe that you are very religious in all respects. For while I was passing through and examining the objects of your worship, I also found an altar with this inscription, to an unknown God. This is interesting. What would happen is, as the Roman Empire expanded, the Romans would, as part of their effort to incorporate cultures and nations that they conquered, bring their deities. These were polytheistic deities represented in idols, stone statues. And so there were literally hundreds and hundreds of them accumulated by the Roman Empire. And I think part of the thinking people believed was they didn't really know which one of these gods was real and which wasn't. So why not err on the side of caution and just include them all in some kind of service? But we know of other references to this as well, that there was one that said to an unknown God. And there's two schools of thought as to what's behind this. The one, maybe more cynical, is in case we've missed any important deities, this is our catch-all, right? This is, if we've missed you, this one's for you. But a lot of people think, and I'm inclined to think this way as well, this seems to be what Paul thought, that many of these polytheistic systems are really incomplete worldviews. And there's a great book by a guy named Don Richardson called Eternity in Their Hearts, where he studied a number of examples where right next to the traditional idol-worshiping sort of magic practice, there will be another practice to the ultimate deity with whom the people have lost touch. And you see echoes of this, for example, in Native American spiritualities. There's a lot of examples. I think that's how Paul is reading this, that in spite of all of these hundreds of various limited nature deities, there's sort of a knowledge that that's not a complete explanation for the world, and there's probably a real being who is completely sovereign. And so Paul's picking up on that, taking it that way, and he's saying, what therefore you worship in ignorance, this I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and all things in it, since he is Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands, neither is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all life and breath and all things. Then he goes on, he made from one every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, that they should seek God, and if perhaps they might grope for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and exist, as even some of your own poets have said, for we also are his offspring. Now my version here has that last bit quoted, but a lot of people think that the previous sentence was also a quote from Epimenides, this last one being from religious philosopher Aratus, the first from 600 BC, the second from 300 BC. So Paul is actually quoting their philosophers, which is also their religious authorities, approvingly. But then he says, being then the offspring of God, we ought not to think that the divine nature is like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by the art and thought of man. Therefore, having overlooked the times of ignorance, God is now declaring to men that all everywhere should turn to God because he has fixed a day in which he will judge the world in righteousness through a man whom he has appointed, having furnished proof to all men by raising him from the dead. Now when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some began to sneer, but others said, we shall hear you again concerning this. And my belief is he actually didn't get to finish his whole talk. The idea of death and resurrection, this unity of the physical and the spiritual and the biblical worldview, is very alien to the pantheistic mindset in the philosophy in the Roman Empire. So they couldn't choke it down. They interrupted him. At any rate, there's several things I think we can pull out of this little talk, having to do, again, with the question of, from the standpoint of the Bible, what is its view of the relationship between Christianity and other religions? First of all, it is that other religions contain truth and value. As I said, this is quite clearly a quote from one of their religious philosophers. We also are his offspring. The other quote actually starts, if I remember right, by saying, it is with Zeus that we have to do, for in him we live and move and have our being. So that's really interesting, right? He's actually looking at this master deity in the Roman pantheon and basically saying, yeah, that's God, but I'm here to tell you about accurate information about that God. So this, I think, is really important. And I've watched, since I've been thinking about this and following Christ for many years now, I've watched Christians make mistakes kind of painfully in this area. And oftentimes it takes the form of Christians sort of mixing their own culture and background with Christianity and sort of having a complete rejection of everything from other cultures. It's very unpleasant. Now, a lot of Christians have done a great job of embodying the fact that this message is for all people, all places, all times, and all cultures. And again, that Don Richardson is a great example of that, if you're interested in reading, of really helping people put the Bible into their own language and help them understand it through their own cultural lens, and, like Paul's doing here, help them see the links between their religious systems that they had grown up with and the true parts of those in this actual information. And this, I think, is interesting too. I don't know if you caught it, that they should everywhere, at all places and times, should seek God, if perhaps they might grope for him and find him. He is not far from each one of us. So in contradiction to the way some Christians have talked, God is involved with all people in all places and at all times and cares about them. And in fact, according to this, is really not very distant from them. And I find this, for one, very comforting, that this is part of the biblical view of other religions. He does then go on. If you noticed, we saw this as we were distilling the main points of biblical Christianity last week. Not only is there this simple message in the Bible, but as we noted, the Bible makes this claim that it is not just human speculation, but that down through the centuries, God has moved through individuals in different cultures to get authoritative communication. We'll talk about how that could be true in a subsequent session and whether there's any evidence that it's true or not. That was a big question for me. But I'm just noting that this is part of an important claim that the Bible makes for itself. And of course, for me, it was sort of a good news, bad news thing. If it can be validated, it would be incredibly good news to have real, reliable information like that. However, it made my issues with science all the more urgent, because if this is God speaking, he ought not to be screwing up history or science, right? So we'll get to that later. But what you're seeing is absolutely consistent throughout the Bible. Paul's not saying, hey guys, in the Areopagus, here's some of my ideas. This is what I think is true. Here's why I think it's true. He's saying God is now declaring to men. So, as a logical extension of that, we come to the fingernails on the blackboard part of this view of Christianity and other religions. That where other religions disagree, other religions are wrong. And boy, is that a conflict with so much of the thinking that we live in today. You see it here. Paul feels the freedom to affirm the things that he says, yes, this is true. These other things, making a little statue and worshiping that statue that you made, those things are not true. And we could dig deeper. There were some horrendous practices done as part of various Roman religious service, especially temple prostitution, where children could be stolen and enslaved and put into prostitution. And so I think this idea of bringing in the right and wrong is difficult. Now, we talked about a key part of this last week, setting aside this idea that there's no such thing as truth. Let's just consider this claim. I think it's logical. If this is actual communication from God, then, as Paul's saying, these things are right. These other things that contradict are not true. So that's kind of the sum of the biblical view of other religions, these three ideas. So what I want to do is consider some of the most important objections to this position. You probably are thinking of some of them. I'm going to share with you one of them tonight, my biggest one starting off, and we'll get to the second big one next week. I've phrased it this way. Maybe you are thinking of it a different way. I don't know. How could God send people to hell just because they don't believe in Jesus, right? Especially if they've never even heard of Jesus. I mean, if anything would be unjust and unfair, it seems to me, that certainly would. But there's a cluster of really difficult things in this objection here. Starting, for example, with the idea of hell. I have never liked the idea of hell, and I still don't like it. Let me talk a little bit about what the Bible says about it and share some things with you that I've found helpful. Maybe they'll be helpful for you if you're struggling with this idea as well. The picture in the Bible is that we humans, when we die, we are not going to have our life essence recycled as something else. We are not just going to cease to exist once our bodies are destroyed in death. Instead, according to the Bible, we live in God's universe, and as persons, we remain significant to that God. And so when we die, we are going to come to account for the life that we've lived. And this account won't be maybe by my standards. I think we can all think of all kinds of things we wish God would judge, things that people do that we think are worse than we are. Whether it's people driving like maniacs on 270 or some of the horrendous things that people have done to each other down through human history. I think sometimes we can say, if there is a God, why isn't he doing something about that? But as we went through last week, when we open the Bible, it sort of puts the X-ray screen in front of our own hearts. It's God's standard that we will ultimately be accountable for. I remember talking to a friend of mine who was kind of looking into Christianity, pretty skeptical at the time. And he said to me, I've always kept the 10 Commandments. And he claims, I don't remember this, but he claims that I laughed at him. If you stop and think about, say, the two that Jesus said were the most important, love the Lord God with all your heart and all your mind and all your soul, and love your neighbor as yourself, just those two, if I'm honest at all, I realize, my thought life, my decisions today, for example, more or less continually fall far short of just those two things. So that's, according to the Bible, where we stand. We live in God's moral universe. The people we injure are people he loves, and that's an issue, as we went through last week. But the main point of biblical Christianity is that God has essentially solved that issue at his own expense. Here's Jesus. He says, "Truly I say to you, he who hears my word and believes him who sent me has eternal life. He does not come into judgment, but is passed out of death and into life." This is the whole central feature of God's rescue plan, is that he managed to be both just and able to love us if we'll just exercise our personal trust in him. So really, that's not the big issue. And we even see in passages like this, where, sometimes you wonder, why does God let all this horrendous stuff just go on and on? Well, one part of that answer, I think, is in 2 Peter 3:9. God's not slow about his promise, but he's waiting. Why? Because he doesn't want anyone to perish. He wants everyone to have the maximal chance to change their mind and take advantage of this opportunity to be freely forgiven, restored to relationship with God. So what do I take away from this that's helpful for me? As C.S. Lewis said, there are two types of people, ultimately: those who say to God, "Thy will be done," and those to whom God says, "Thy will be done." In other words, God has built a bridge right back to each of our front doors and has knocked on the door, and we then get to say, "No, I want nothing to do with you," or "Yes." So I think the essence of the idea of hell, or to put it positively, the essence of the idea of heaven, heaven is about restored relationship with God and restored relationships with each other and even with nature based on that restoration. Hell is the negative of that. Hell is God's monument to our free will, as one person said. That ultimately, if we decide we don't want to have anything to do with God, then we will continue to exist, and it won't be good, because we were created to live with him in a love relationship. So God hates hell too, and it is about our free will and honoring our free will, and those things have helped me with the general idea. Maybe they'll help you, I don't know. But then let's broaden the lens back out a little bit to the other pieces of this objection, right? Is it the case, then, are we saying, for example, claims like this? Jesus says, "I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me." So here, there's another piece of this whole objection for me, which was, what about people who've never even heard about Jesus? Is this really true, that the only people that get restored to relationship with God get restored through Jesus? And the answer, I think, is yes. But does that mean that people that have never had the opportunity to hear about Jesus are necessarily then rejected by God? And the answer to that is no. I am grateful to say, not because I want it to be that way, but because the Bible itself teaches that. So let me share some examples. This is a passage that I've come to really appreciate. This is early on, the life of Abraham around 2000 BC. Abraham, of course, the first of the Jewish nation, a major step in God's rescue plan to bring the Jewish nation into the world and then ultimately to bring the Messiah into the world. And Abraham was quite old at this point. If I remember, he was 95 or 99 years old. He and his wife Sarah had never had a child, and God had made promises to them that they would have a child. And this is one of them. He took Abraham outside. He said, "Now look toward the heavens. Count the stars if you're able to count them." And then God said to Abraham, "So shall your descendants be." Not only are you going to have a child, but you're going to have a huge, uncountable number of descendants through your own child. And then here's the odd thing. It says, "Then he believed in the Lord, and God reckoned it to him as righteousness." So rather than God saying, "That's good, Abraham, that you believe me about the kid," he says, "Because you trusted me in this, I'm going to give you the gift of right standing with me," righteousness. Now, if you think I'm making too much out of this, let me give you another reference to it. This is all the way forward in Romans. After the death and resurrection of Jesus, as the full message of Christ is going out to the Roman Empire, Paul refers to this event. He says, "What then shall we say that Abraham, our forefather, according to the flesh, has found? What does the scripture say? And Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. Now to the one who works, his wage is not reckoned as a favor, but as what is due. But to the one who does not work, but believes in him who justifies the ungodly, his faith is reckoned as righteousness." So here Paul is taking this core message of biblical Christianity, which is all God's looking for, as a yes, called faith, and a move of active trust in what he's offering. And that's the essence of it. But here's the thing. Did Abraham, back in 2000 BC, did he know anything at all about what the Messiah was going to do? No. He had very little information. He knew nothing about Jesus dying on the cross to substitute for us and all this core of the biblical message. He knew that he had never been able to have a kid, that he was really old, and that God had promised him, you and Sarah are going to have a baby. So we get from this, and yet Paul comes along and says that's exactly the same transaction as when what we would say somebody becomes a Christian, when they put their faith in God, and there's this exchange that God gives us as a gift, right standing with him. He says that's the same thing that happened to Abraham 2,000 years ago. My point is, I guess I would summarize it this way. And the Bible teaches that God requires a faith response to the knowledge we have, not what we don't have. And I, for one, am immensely relieved that this is the teaching. So God will apply ultimately what he did when he sent his Son into the world to give us righteousness. But for those who have very little information, God is looking for an attitude, not a response to something they know nothing about. And I think you can even see this in our passage that we read earlier in Acts 17. You guys may have noticed this. What does it mean when he says, therefore, having overlooked the times of ignorance? Well, I'm not sure exactly what it means, but it certainly means that it's important to God how much we actually know, right? That's clearly some kind of a factor here. We also saw the claim in Acts 17 that God was never far from anybody through all these times and places, in spite of their very different levels of knowledge about this rescue plan that we read of fully in the Bible. I do need to qualify this just a little bit. When we say faith response, I'm not talking about just any religious activity or impulse towards goodness or whatever. In fact, there's a tremendous amount of religious impulse that is sort of opposite this definition of biblical faith. I'm defining it this way by looking across the Bible. Faith is an active thing. It's not mere mental assent. It's a decision. It relies on the will, not just in the mind, involving a willingness to depend on God's promises based on evidence we have that he is trustworthy and loving. It's a verdict on his character and an active move to trust him. So, we were talking about Jesus's big enemies. If you read through his life in the Gospels, they were religious people, very religious people, but their religiosity was almost the opposite of this attitude. It was a proud self-righteousness. So there's a qualifier there. It's not just saying any old religious or spiritual inclination. We're talking about some kind of a response, an attitude that God's looking for to the information we have through nature, according to the Bible, through the information we have in our own conscience, to the information we have in the various levels of truth and falsehood and different ideas we're confronted with, the various levels of evidence for who God says he is and what he wants to give us. It's a response in active trust to that matters. So I don't know about you, but I find that tremendously helpful to this first objection. The other big objection, for me anyway, was this idea as I came to Christianity and saw its claims that, come on now, aren't all religions, once you scratch the surface and get down to the big ideas, aren't they really all the same? Aren't they, as one popular saying goes, just different roads up the same mountain? And isn't it kind of uncool to talk about truth and falsehood? And so what I want to do next week is dig into that particular objection. And what I want to do is to do some study, some comparative study, comparison contrast to two great world religions that I've found personally good examples to study. Hinduism on the one hand, which I think is a good example of a religious system that is not based in any way on the Bible. The oldest writings, the Vedas, go back nearly as old as the oldest portions of the Old Testament. And then also do some comparison and contrast with Islam, which I think is a great example of a religious system that is explicitly based on the Bible, claiming that the Old and the New Testament are from God, but that the Quran, this additional book, is also from God. So that's where I want to go next week. So let me unshare the screen and stop there and see if people have any questions or comments about this issue or anything else we've been talking about. It's fair game. Love questions.
Douglas?
Yeah.
I feel like I, in many ways, empathize at this stage of my life with agnostics more probably than I have in the past. But agnostics are sort of the ones who pull this card, right? The all roads lead to the same house. Where I think the atheists know all the religions are just wrong.
Right.
Is actually more palatable than that one, as far as like having more logical sort of like having more of a consistent sort of basis. Not that it's a more right claim, but it feels a little bit more like honest of a take, you know? Where I feel like the agnostic one feels a little bit more like having your cake and eating it too.
You can throw stones and not have to commit.
Yeah, I mean,
it's an interesting point. I think the agnostic thing is one version of it. In my view, there, Johnny, the biggest basis for that sort of a claim that they're all roads up to the same thing comes from the spiritual relativism viewpoint.
Right.
That we're all right. And so really, I think the advantage with the claim is we can investigate it. That's what I want to do next week, right? Is it true? Let's go take a look. What do they assert in these basic worldview level truths? Not just the nitpicky, do you hang out on Sunday or Saturday, but like the actual truth claims, are they in fact the same, or are there big differences?
Right.
Yeah, so we can go study it, right?
So it's like as soon as it comes from a source that seems like it's from man's effort, then human beings are all on board.
Yeah, we would all like to think we're super objective and analytical, and I've lumped myself in here. I am as vulnerable to reading from the bottom line up as the next person, right? But we went through that originally. I think it's a tendency that can be resisted and should be resisted, and with the right discipline we can try to think. But I think that's interesting. The multiverse deal, we can talk about that on the week we go into science. I think 2 weeks from tonight. My latest understanding is, in theory, it's not empirically detectable. So maybe there's something new there.
So you had the quote from, I think it was John 14:6.
Yep.
That Jesus says everything that, or basically saying you get saved through me.
Mm-hmm.
How would you address the question of, well, does that mean then that everybody's saved?
Yeah, that's
no
a good.
What? Because if Jesus is God, he's big enough to save everybody through all time period, regardless of if they know about him.
Right.
So he just save everybody no matter what.
And not only that, but he says he wants to, right? In multiple places. That
right.
The whole mission, Jesus says, is to clear the path for every single person. And I tried to address that a little bit. It's a great point. Is that every person everywhere, regardless of what they know, can be reconciled with God through what Christ did, even if they don't know about it, if they express faith. The key, I think, in the biblical view is that it's a decision. Every individual gets to say ultimately yes or no to God's efforts to reach out to them. Some people know a lot more the guys in the Areopagus, after Paul got done talking to them, they knew a lot more than before he talked to them. So now they're more accountable for that information. But the Bible seems to be saying that in all places and in all times, we read it tonight, right, in Acts 17, God is near people, and some truth is getting through nature, through the conscience, through true ideas that they've learned. And so the real issue is sort of like a marriage proposal. So not that everybody will be saved, but everybody gets the option. That's what God's seeking, is the yes or the no. I want to be with you or I don't. I trust you or I don't trust you and want to be on my own. So I think that's the biblical answer, and it seems to indicate, I wish it said, one of my favorite writers is a Christian who believed that everybody ultimately gets reconciled with God. A guy named George MacDonald. He got booted from the Presbyterian church he was leading because he was teaching that. The Bible doesn't seem to teach that, as far as I can tell. It's not a major emphasis. I wish it were true. I hope it's true. What I think is clear is that God is not going to come in and break down my door, right? He's built the path right to my door, but he's knocking, and I get to say yes or I get to say no, and I'm responsible then for that decision. So I think there's like at least a couple of errors that Christians can make on this whole thing, right? The one that really makes my skin crawl, I remember watching a guy from a denomination that I won't name being interviewed on national TV, and somebody asked him this question, like, if people never heard about Jesus, are they rejected by God? And he's like, absolutely. And I hate that. I think it's terrible. Because if anything's unfair, that's unfair. But more importantly, who cares what I think? The Bible doesn't teach that, as I've tried to show tonight. The opposite error would be to sort of wave the whatever wand and say, whatever you believe with sincerity is fine. No, there's an issue each of us faces that God is coming to us and asking us, do you want to trust me or do you want to reject me? So it's not that everything goes, right? So there's at least a couple of errors that you could make here, I think.